Michael Arthur, former diplomat, now with Boeing. I have a question to Alia and Ben, and then one to you, Nigel. To you both, could you say a bit more about the Maghreb, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia? Now, they may be below your threshold for conflict, but the instability is patent there. So just a word on that would be interesting. And to you, Nigel, how much of this material have you been able to feed into the MOD for the Strategic Defence and Security Review, which is ongoing at the moment?
Okay, all right. Do you want to do the Maghreb first, Alia?
Yeah, so the main flashpoints in the Maghreb that might fall just below the threshold of conflict are in the Sinai region, where, as I mentioned before, militants seem to be getting access to increasingly heavy weaponry, which is probably related to their increasing attachment to the Islamic State, and that possibly comes through Gaza, but also out of Libya. And the other, Libya, I think, is in a state of outright civil conflict. But the trend for Libya is actually slightly more hopeful in the sense that there is a peace process. So there are attempts to rally a peace process around a set of concrete issues. And I think that, what we have to remember is that the Islamic State doesn't sort of come in columns in invading armies and crossing borders. It actually, the way it works is that it usually co-opts and infiltrates pre-existing groups. And I think that's what we're seeing in Libya, and the longer that conflict goes on the ground, the longer that process will happen. And that's an especially ripe opportunity for them comes in Gaddafi, areas where the Gaddafi tribe are based, as around Sirte, and populations around Bani Walid that might feel that they have no stake whatsoever in the current system. But Libya is slightly more helpful in that there is definitely an internationally perceived need for peace between the two warring sides. Whereas in Egypt, the consensus seems to be to support the current government. And it is locked in an increasingly intense conflict now with militants. And it's a very big question mark whether the strategy of beating them and beating them down and beating people that look like them down is going to be viable for anyone in the longer term, and whether that's in any way going to promote stability. So I think in the longer term, Egypt is very, very worrying, and actually Libya, because it is so attention-grabbing, we've managed to develop a little bit of consensus around what needs to happen, and the Algerians actually have helped a lot with that.
Well, Ben.
All I'd add about the Sahel is 2 points. First of all, many of the grievances that Islamic State and indeed self-radicalized violent extremists fasten on are essentially local. As an example, the foreign tourist hotels in Tunisia, which of course were attacked, in a sense they're a symbol of the kleptocratic nature of the previous regime, who handed out the licenses to build the hotels to their cronies, who I imagine are still raking in the money, let alone the flaunting of a very un-Islamic hardcore way of life that was represented by the tourists. I think, though, if you look at the lower level of the Maghreb as it passes into the Sahel, there is quite a lot of international activity to try and help stabilise that, not just the French-led interventions in Mali and then the Central African Republic, but the way those energised other international actors, being individual states or the EU and the African Union, to sort of take some of the burden to help that. And I think there's also an opportunity in Nigeria with President Buhari having very clear and credible ideas about how he can deal with Boko Haram. But, of course, as well as dealing with the military symptoms, there is a need to deal with the underlying conditions that help create it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, to answer your question, the MOD at various different configurations do consume this data. They are certainly aware of it. I'm kind of hoping they'll have bought a few copies of the Armed Conflict Survey. They're normally pretty reliable customers for the military balance, and indeed, of course, we do have some engagement with them on that. And I think that to the extent that there is outreach in relation to the forthcoming review, we expect to be participating in that in various different ways. Right. Now, the lady at the back there, I think, had a question. Yes.
Olivia Bosch. A question for Ben. You mentioned, for example, the Malaysia battalion that ISIS have recently formed. Are the numbers of foreign fighters that come into the realm of ISIS, do they affect the local population at all, or are the numbers low enough, despite the high press coverage here, that ISIS intentionally keep the foreign fighters away to help with their fighting?
You're referring to the fighters when they actually arrive in the camp?
Yes, yes. Or maybe that's a further question as well to elaborate.
Okay. There are a number of contradictory impressions one gets from media reports. First of all, there's a degree of friction sometimes between those foreign fighters and the locals in Raqqa or Mosul. But I'd imagine ISIS will be trying to manage that to retain the consent. The next thing is that foreign fighters coming from many European and Western states lack military training and experience. Many coming from other parts of the world where there's national service have some. And there is some evidence of some ISIS attacks, the actual close assault on the government-held position, the hardcore, pretty professional ISIS infantry, sometimes being preceded by human waves of less capable fighters. And there are indications that they use foreign fighters to make up those people. That's not to say there won't be foreign fighters who become effective ISIS infantry. I mean, the other point that ISIS has appealed for foreign volunteers is civilian experts, across the spectrum of running a state, although there's very little media reporting of how many have actually made their way and stayed there.
I don't think the evidence, as far as I'm aware, Ali, you may have something to say about this, is that the foreign fighters tend to be grouped by nationality and not, to intermingle or to integrate. We've seen some contingents of foreign fighters, particularly Chechens, large numbers, and of course these are battle-hardened and experienced fighters who tend to, be used as a kind of shock force.
On that issue of foreign fighters, and I'll be quiet after this, I just wanted to say that, and this is also to go back to the original question I had, I think that operationally there is a big bifurcation that can be made between foreign fighters that come from the West and the ones that come from the region, mainly North Africa. I think that manifests itself probably at an everyday level on the battlefield. But I think also in terms of understanding that phenomenon, the fighters that come to the West, from the West, a lot of the time tend to be their grievances are ideas driven, and their radicalization is an ideas-based process. But the majority of foreign fighters are coming from the region, and that has to do with grievance-based radicalization. And so to go back to the point about North Africa, while I mentioned the hot areas in the Sinai and Libya, I think in Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia especially, the grievances that have produced this phenomenon are intensifying. And so in the longer term, that file is going to be open and it's probably going to thicken. But I think it's always important when we talk about foreign fighters to make a distinction between the ones that come from the West who tend to be, but not always searching for meaning, and ones that are more motivated by issues of grievance or survival.
Thank you very much. Yes, the lady in the front row.
Thanks a lot. Ines from Weitershausen, LSE. My question goes to Alia. I'd be interested in how you, bring together your assessment, a cautiously positive assessment with regard to Libya, and then the struggle of the governments to get a hold of the large amount of weapons that is currently still in the country, and actually all the cries for even further arms deployment. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there are 28 million weapons at the very least circulating among a tiny population in Libya. I don't mean to be overly positive about Libya. Libya is I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it's a mess. And I think the Prime Minister last year said that there is no state in Libya to say whether it has failed or not. I mean, the situation is dire. But my positivity was only surrounding the fact that we're more and more recognizing that now. And unfortunately, it takes a sense of alarmism over the Islamic State, I think, to redirect attention towards Libya. Because I think we maybe did, in my humble opinion, we did a little too much in 2011 when we went in that the mandate changed from protecting certain areas to regime change. And we've done much too little since then. So I think now the balance is reasserting itself, and we're sort of paying attention. But the situation is complicated. It's not positive. And when we seize on positive pieces of news, such as the Islamic State being ejected from Derna in the east recently, who are the people ejecting them? Not very nice guys either. So there are many multi-layered conflicts in Libya, and there can't be too much political will to try and address them.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. Yeah.
Colonel Zulfikar, I just want to get a sense from you regarding when you talked about that most of the issues were local, when you talked about these groups, especially about ISIS, because ISIS says it's a caliphate. So it's not really representing local disputes, it's actually representing a global ideology in that sense. But there seems to be very little, you would expect that based on history, a caliphate, so to say, the first thing they would talk about is something anti-Israel. There's very little which seems to come out from the Islamic State against Israel, or from Israel against the Islamic State. Where do you think it is that? Is it because of the Iran factor or the Shia factor?
You again, I guess,
Is
Anna?
that for me? Or Ben?
Yeah.
That's a very interesting point, Zulfikar. As the Islamic State sits in Syria and Iraq, it's not actually fighting Israel. I mean, its enemies are all around it. And I think if we had someone from effectively the government of the Islamic State here, they'd say that actually they've got to defeat Assad, and they've got to achieve their strategic aims in Iraq, and also properly establish themselves as a state before they had a go at Israel. Just looking at it from the other direction, I mean, I think Israel, with regard to Syria, has often been, before the Islamic State arose and the civil war in Syria, Israel had achieved a degree of strategic stability with the Assad regime and a degree of deterrence. What's quite clear is that Israel is watching what's happening in Syria extremely closely, and at times has fired against attack, responded to fire that's come across its border. But the Israeli leadership gives an impression of being much more preoccupied about Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I argue in the essay, actually, in the survey, I think that we have to understand the origins of the Islamic State, which superficially looks as though it's an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda's global project. But it's actually very different. What it's done is take the global jihad and some of its apertures or manifestations and just intensively localize them. And it relies essentially on local identities, whereas bin Laden was trying to appeal to globalized identities. The Islamic State has to be understood as a very localized phenomenon, and that is why, in terms of their actions and their ideology, they have become monomaniacal and obsessed with the Shia. So there is a very important process of localization going on, but they haven't forgotten the West. And I think that what the Islamic State represents is this kind of three-pronged threat to the West, the state, and to society. So it's trying to bring everything together under one umbrella. But maybe we'll prioritize them, in terms of time. But with Israel, I think that there is work to capture Al-Quds, which is the be-all and end-all if you're a jihadist. And some of that is happening in Gaza, and with the challenging Hamas, because of course we have to remember that some of the worst internal conflicts are between political Islamists like Hamas and jihadists. There's no love lost there. And Hamas is actually now apparently losing its grip on many of these groups within the Gaza Strip. And I think that a lot of that rhetoric that we're going to see coming out from those affiliates is going to be about capturing Al-Quds and about making a move towards Israel, eventually.
Okay, the lady in the second row, thank you.
Hello, I'm Alison, I work in the Ministry of Defence. But two questions, if I may. The first to Antonio and Virginia. You both, in your presentations, mentioned various aspects of the criminal terrorist nexus. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about any of the trends that you've seen over the past year. Is economic funding of terrorism becoming increasingly globalized, and how is that manifesting itself? Second question is on propaganda and social media and the general narrative of armed conflicts? I mean, do we see terrorist or Islamic State or any other such organisation becoming increasingly sophisticated in this over the past year? Thank you.
Okay, right, you guys first. I'll think about who's best placed to answer the social media one. You know, don't all speak at once.
Sure.
Okay, you go first.
So on the crime and terror nexus, global flows or local resources. I'll give you, for instance, the example of Boko Haram, because I think we really have to look at each group individually, because depending on how advanced and how developed and how internationally connected they are, things change quite considerably. If you look at a group like Boko Haram that has over the year really become a force in the region, you see that these days the group no longer needs to rely on foreign support to run its operations. It started in a localized way. Over the years, it managed to obtain support in training, weapons, and also financially from external actors, especially Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. But it has graduated to a point where actually local criminal activities such as bank robberies, they've been fundamental for its growth, extortions, and other forms of lower level criminalities, actually they are sufficient for the group to sustain itself, alongside abductions within Nigeria or in neighboring countries that the group can actually manage itself. So although there is a tendency towards transnational connections and flows, some of these groups have actually managed to build quite strong local funding sources.
In the case of Latin America, I think there is a very clear linkage between the amount of economic power that these groups acquire through mainly the drug trade, but there's also diversification that has other consequences that I'm going to mention briefly. But and this economic power translating into firepower. So Latin America, especially Central America and Mexico, where the drug trade funnels to the U.S. Is facing a very unique challenge in the history of mankind. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, in which it's criminal groups that don't have political motivations that acquire the level of firepower and tactical, boldness to defy the state. So how do you counter that? With military tools, with police tools, or with something in between? It's a dilemma that Latin America has not been able to solve at the moment, and at the same time the threat is not going to disappear anytime soon. And the other manifestation, I think, of this crime violence, I don't want to say terror, but crime violence linkage, is the diversification of criminality in Latin America towards, for instance, mineral resources, illegal mining, and also extortion. Has led to some territorial disputes, because these are issues that are based on the soil, either extorting businesses, transportation companies that are based on the ground, or mineral resources that are also on the ground. So there is this fierce territorial dispute in Central America and Mexico for the control of these resources.
Okay, thank you very much. On the social media point, I think as a general proposition, social media is just playing a progressively greater role in virtually every kind of conflict that you can imagine. The use by Islamic State of social media has been extensively highlighted, the way that they are able to proselytize, put across their message, shape perceptions, and in some ways shape the battle space. Why did so many of the Iraqi regular forces bravely run away the minute Islamic State appeared on the horizon? Because they had been mentally prepared for the prospect of defeat. If you look at Syria generally as a civil war, that's been characterized as the first cyber civil war, insofar as every group engaged in that conflict is actively and aggressively using social media and messaging to shape perceptions, to gather and disseminate information. And the same thing, of course, we've seen in Ukraine and Crimea. Now, of course, with Ukraine, it was easy for the Russians. The networks they were co-opting were their networks. Ukraine didn't have its own international internet access point. The Russians knew the whole thing inside out, but in many ways it was a model information warfare campaign in that the Russians firstly secured their own information space, so no competing narrative could challenge that of the Putin government, but also to create perceptions within the area that mattered most, about, namely eastern Ukraine, about what was happening, what the prospects of success would be. So yes, I mean, it's just this is bigger and bigger and bigger.
Which, I think that what my colleague Chris McMurdo, who's not here, but what we would argue is that things like social media, I think, enable the threat and they enable the problem. They don't necessarily drive it. And I think in some of the media debates, we don't make a distinction between drivers of the threat and drivers of terrorism and enablers. And I think we've blurred the line when we talk about social media, such that there's now this belief that if you shut them down on Twitter, we won't have a problem. So I think social media is a great enabler of the problem, but it doesn't necessarily drive it.
Okay, Alia, that's a very good point. Thank you. The gentleman in the second row there, and then I think I'm going to have to close the batting order, I'm afraid. Please.
Thank you, Phil Eyre, member of the Institute. On the pamphlet that we were handed out on our seats here, there's 2 bullets: hybrid warfare, criminality and conflict. Now, I think you've talked about criminality and conflict from other than state actors, but when state actors pursue criminality and conflict, seems to be an overlap with hybrid warfare. How does the Armed Conflict Survey handle the concept of hybrid warfare, and what observations do you have of it? If I may, secondly, can we count as good news the lack of focus on weapons of mass destruction? Does the Armed Conflict Survey talk about the, we don't hear about greater emphasis on nuclear rhetoric as part of warfare. We don't hear about radiological weapons, biological weapons. There's plenty of Ebola without being weaponized, and a little bit of chemical. But what does the Armed Conflict Survey have to say about that?
Well, the short answer is on the latter point, not very much, because the simple fact is that none of these capabilities have been deployed in the conflicts that we are analyzing. We've seen, for example, the deployment of some chemical weapons by the Assad regime in Syria, barrel bombs, and I think there is profound skepticism about all the Syrian regime's chemical weapons having been recovered by OPCW. But that is referred to in the body of the text. Other than that, I think that in the main, these capabilities are, within the purview of nation states. We're not seeing much in the way of nation-state warfare. For what it's worth, I personally am quite profoundly skeptical about the prospects of terrorist use of these capabilities. There's precious little evidence for it, and when you analyse operationally what's involved, it's harder than you might at first blush think. So the short answer to your question is no, we don't. But obviously, if any of these capabilities were to be deployed in an actual conflict in an operationally meaningful way, then of course we would look at them. But these are topics that we do deal with in a separate sector. Ben, you want to?
On state actors and criminality, I've done some work on this in previous conflicts. First of all, there's no doubt that you sometimes get state actors either turning a blind eye to illicit activity or actually being corrupted by it in a way that weakens the security of the state. And if you take Ukraine as an example, it is a major entrepot to Europe for cigarette smuggling, to the extent there's Gaza-style tunnels built under the border. And that can do nothing for the overall security of Ukraine. The next factor you get is dodgy militias with criminal tendencies. Sometimes that can be extremist crime, or sometimes it can be extortion, getting, if you like, co-opted by a government. And we've seen an element of that in Ukraine. It was a major feature on all sides of the war in Bosnia. This can also be an unexpected consequence of economic sanction or economic or arms sanctions being employed. And again, in Bosnia, what you got was the arms embargo, resulting in all three factions making use of smuggling networks to get equipment and ammunition. And we also saw that in Iraq, where at times one of the ways that Iran smuggled explosively formed projectiles, the very effective anti-armor roadside bombs, across the border of southern Iraq into Basra, was to actually allow smugglers to do it, the smugglers themselves earning some revenue off it. And my judgment is that you know, in this complex instability and these modern conflicts where you've got failing and fragile states, this is going to be an enduring problem.
Ben, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I'm going to have to bring this to an end. I'd just like to make the point, for those of you who have sufficient interest, that copies of the Armed Conflict Survey are available for purchase outside at a significantly reduced 40% reduction of £50 down from 84. So if you would like to purchase one, I'm sure we will be able to make that happen. I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming. Thank you for some very intelligent questions, and please join me in thanking our panelists who've done the heavy lifting.